Chapter 6. The night brought heavy clouds and a cold wind whistling through the spires of Hag Grafe. More than 100 feet above the castle courtyard, a heavily cloaked figure leaned slightly from a recessed doorway and studied the two bright moons gleaming over the eastern horizon. After a moment, a patch of iron-grey clouds slid across the face of the moons, plunging the fortress into abyssal darkness. Without a sound, the cloaked figure leapt from the doorway and glided like a spectre across the narrow stone bridge. 7 similarly cloaked figures followed, seemingly heedless of the vast gulf yawning beneath them. By the time the moons had shed their gauzy shroud, the procession had disappeared into the tower at the other end of the span. Once inside Nagaira's tower, Malus pulled back his woolen cowl and scrutinized the small group waiting for him in the passage just beyond the doorway. Tonight, he and his retainers were dressed for war. Beneath the heavy, dark cloaks, each Druki wore an articulated breastplate and a mail skirt over his dark leather chiton. Pauldrons protected their shoulders, lending them a bulkier, more imposing silhouette, while their arms and legs were sheathed in articulated vambraces and greaves. Each piece of armour rested on a layer of felt to muffle the rattle of joints and plates, and to help them insulate the body from the cold steel. Malus and 2 of his retainers carried repeating crossbows under their cloaks, along with their customary swords. Nagaira's warriors were similarly equipped, surrounding their mistress like baleful crows. Several carried short throwing spears, of a type Malus had never seen before, while others carried small repeating crossbows. They eyed the heavily armed interlopers with clear suspicion, all but Dalvar, who span one of his stilettos on an armoured fingertip, and grinned mockingly at the newcomers. Like Malus, Nagaira wore plate armour over her chiton and robes, and carried 2 swords at her hip. The bookish diffidence was gone, and Malus was surprised to see how much she resembled her fearsome father. She held out a gauntleted hand draped with 7 leather thongs. From each thong hung a glittering object of silver and crystal, the size of a Druki thumb. "Wear these somewhere against your skin," Nagaira said, her voice sharp and commanding. "Once we are inside the tower, touch nothing unless I say so." Malus took the talismans without a word, picked one for himself, and passed the rest on to his companions. On close inspection, each talisman was a small silver fist clutching a ball of crystal. The irregular crystal had somehow been fractured in such a way as to create a complex spiral within the centre of the stone. The silver hand was etched with dozens of tiny runes that defied easy identification. When he tried to focus on one, Malus's eyes began to blink and water, as though someone had blown a handful of sand into them. He gave up trying after a moment, and slipped the thong around his neck, then carefully tucked the talisman under the lip of his breastplate. It dug into his chest just underneath the armour plate, and felt like a piece of trapped ice. Nagaira watched carefully to make sure that each of the Druki followed her instructions. Once she was satisfied, she said, "The entrance to the burrows is fairly close by. Once we're in the tunnels, stick close and keep your weapons ready. There are wild Norglir roaming down there, and worse. It won't take long to reach the tunnels underneath Uriel's tower, but we may have to do some digging once we get there." The last part brought Malus up short.
"We might have to do some digging? You don't know anyone who's used this approach before?"
Nagaira shrugged. "I don't know for certain that the entrance even exists. In theory, it should."
"In theory?
You would rather storm the ground floor entrance, or climb the tower wall in full view of half the fortress? Dalvar's mocking grin widened. Malus dreamed of peeling the skin from his streaking face.
Lead on,
He hissed. With a smug half-bow, Nagaira turned on her heel and led the raiding party down the long stairs to the ground floor of the tower. Like all the spires in the Drakau's fortress, the tower could only be entered through a single pair of reinforced double doors that opened onto a short corridor leading deeper into the castle complex. When they reached the doors, Malus was surprised to find 4 of Nagaira's retainers in full armour, holding naked swords in their hands. Nagaira caught the expression on the highborn's face and gave a wolfish grin. I can't guarantee that Uriel doesn't have agents of his own in my household, she said, pulling her cowl over her head. So Kaltir and his men are going to ensure that no one leaves the tower until dawn. With that, she led the party out into the castle proper. Over hundreds of years, the Drakau's fortress, also referred to as the Hag by residents of the city, had grown almost like a living thing. Dwarf slaves were expensive and relatively rare. So many years could pass between opportunities for needed repairs and additions. When a part of the castle fell into ruin, other sections were built over and around the wreckage, creating a madman's labyrinth of chaotic passageways, abandoned towers, and walled-off courtyards. What had begun as a relatively small citadel with a single octagonal wall now covered more than a square mile of land and possessed 4 concentric defensive walls, each one built to enclose a new wave of expansion. It was said that no one person knew the fortress in its totality. New servants were often sent on errands into the sprawling grounds, and not found again for days, if at all. Nagaira led the cowled procession quickly and assuredly through a series of courtyards and execution grounds, swiftly leaving the more populated precincts of the fortress behind for a region that showed signs of progressive abandonment. The farther they went, the more desolate and decrepit the surroundings appeared. They crossed over cracked, vine-covered flagstones and under leaning piles of rock that used to be walls or spires. At one point, they were forced to climb over a pile of broken stone that was all that remained of a span linking 2 old towers. Small creatures scuttled through the shadows around them. At one point, traversing a larger, overgrown courtyard, something large hissed a warning at them from a pile of vine-covered rubbish. The Juruki levelled their crossbows, but Nagaira waved impatiently for them to continue. After a time, the raiders reached a section of the fortress that had clearly been abandoned for many decades. Crossing through a doorway stained with mould, Malus found himself in a large, rectangular space dominated by what appeared to be a huge hearth. After a moment, he realized that he was standing in an old forge. The bellows and other wooden tools had long since rotted away. Suddenly, there was a flare of blue-green light. One of Nagaira's retainers handed her a shuttered lantern burning with pale witchfire. She held it aloft and turned in a quick circle, gaining her bearings. There, she said, pointing to a corner of the room. Shift the rubbish aside. You'll find a trap-door.
Tired already?
Malus sneered, impatient at the petty contest of wills. Very well. Verhan, Iris, open the trapdoor. The men moved at once, throwing black looks at their erstwhile allies. Aided by Nagaira's lantern, the 2 retainers quickly located a pair of iron rings set into the floor. After several minutes' effort, they managed to heave one of the doors open with a shriek of rusted hinges. Below was a nearly perfect circular tunnel that sank like a well deep into the earth. According to legend, the burrows had been made several hundred years after the hag was first built. One winter, the earth trembled beneath the castle from sundown to sunrise each night. Flagstones heaved and sank, and towers swayed beneath the moon. Nobles and slaves brave enough to venture into the castle cellars claimed to have heard a slow, deep groaning, reverberating through soil and stone, and sometimes clouds of noxious fumes seeped through cracks in the ground and poisoned the unwary. The strange episode ended as abruptly as it had begun on the first day of spring. Later that summer, a work crew rebuilding a collapsed tower discovered the first of the tunnels. Nearly perfectly and bored through solid rock, the passages ran for miles, turning back on themselves again and again, as though formed by a monstrous worm. No one ever found the creature, or creatures, that had formed the tunnels, though over the centuries a multitude of vermin had made the labyrinth their home. There were small, crescent-shaped iron rungs bolted to one side of the tunnel wall. "Remember, stay close," she said, then stepped to the edge of the hole and started descending the rungs, holding the lantern below her as she went. Dalvar stepped quickly up behind her, but Malus froze him in his tracks with a forbidding look and went next instead, crossbow held ready. After about 20 feet, the passage began to curve back towards the surface, until finally the rungs came to an end, and Malus could stand upright. He stood aside Nagaira as they waited for the rest of the band to make their way down. The only sounds in the echoing space were the scuffing of boot heels on iron and the distant echo of dripping water. At one point he stole a glance at his half-sister, but he could see nothing of her expression in the shadowy depths of her cowl, only the tip of her chin and a flash of her pale throat. The edges of her spiral tattoo now crept up the side of her neck. In the unsteady light, it seemed to pulse and shift with a life all its own. As the raiding party sorted itself out, Malus organized his retainers with subtle nods and gestures to intermingle themselves with Nagaira's men. If the two sides couldn't extricate themselves from one another very easily, they couldn't sacrifice the other at the first sign of trouble. It was clear to Malus that the burrows were not made by a thinking being, or at least not a sane one. They were rarely level, plunging and ascending, curving, intersecting and re-intersecting themselves again and again to no evident purpose. Progress was slow, though Nagaira seemed to know exactly where she was going. If there were clues or markers that pointed the way, Malus could not fathom them. A slow tide of unease began to eat at the edges of his steely resolve, but he fought it back with a surge of black hatred.
"I will prevail," he
thought angrily.
"So long as I have my sword and my wits about me, I will not fail."
The raiding party worked their way through the tunnels in silence, their nerves taut and their senses sharp. The air was musty and damp, and a gelid slime covered many of the curved walls. Frequently their booted feet crunched over piles of old brittle bones. Malus bared his teeth at every sound, wondering what creatures might be drawn to investigate the noise. There were numerous points where the burrows rose towards the surface and encountered the foundations of the fortress above. Sometimes the tunnel passed through an abandoned cellar or dungeon. In such cases, Malus saw the remains of crates, tables, and ironwork crushed flat along the burrower's passage. They crossed through several such chambers, each one as deserted as the one before, and the highborn began to relax a little. That was when they nearly stumbled into a deadly trap. The raiding party had stumbled onto yet another large chamber. It was so wide, Malus thought at first that the burrow had intersected a natural cavern, until he noticed the fitted paving stones underneath his boots. The flare of Nagaira's witchlight could not reach the walls or ceiling of the huge space. The parts of the floor Malus could see were strewn with refuse, almost ankle deep. He saw bits of bone and old clothes, rusted tools, leather goods, and scraps of what might have been withered flesh, plus many more less recognizable items. Nagaira led the party deeper into the chamber, stepping carefully through the piled debris. She paused to get her bearings, which was when Malus heard the rustling. It was very quiet, almost like a patter of many small feet, but there was something very strange about the sound that the Highborn couldn't place. He raised his hand in warning.
"No one move,"
he whispered.
"There's something here."
The Juruki paused, their heads turning this way and that as they strained to detect the slightest movement in the darkness surrounding them. The rustling came again, a rapid patter of tiny feet somewhere ahead of them. A pile of refuse was knocked over, scattering what sounded like bits of crockery and loose rock across the chamber.
"Small feet, but a large body,"
Malus thought.
"and it's trying to circle behind us."
Then the pattering sounds came again, but from the other side of the group.
"More than one,"
the Highborn realized.
"But how many?"
Now the Juruki were shifting uneasily, the wary looks on their ghostly faces suggesting that they were thinking along much the same lines as Malus. Lunara edged slightly closer to the Highborn, her twin swords held ready. Malus heard the rustling again, much louder and quicker this time, only it came from directly overhead. Nagaira let out a cry, and her globe of witchlight suddenly flared like a bonfire, driving back the darkness. Malus's eyes narrowed against the glare, and he saw that they were standing in an expansive cellar nearly 20 yards to a side, piled with the rotting remains of casks, crates, and shelves. Pale, hairy cave spiders, the size of ponies, scuttled amongst the refuse or reared up aggressively at the sudden burst of light. Their eyes were the colour of fresh blood, and dark fangs as long as daggers dripped with venom as the scent of fresh meat drove them wild with hunger. Shout of alarm went up from the Druki, and Malus tried to look in every direction at once as he struggled to get a sense of how many spiders there were. 5, 6? They were moving too fast, and there were too many pools of shadow to keep track of them all. The Highborn raised his crossbow and sighted on the nearest one, but the shot went wild as Lunara knocked him forward and out of the path of the spider who pounced from the chamber's high ceiling. Malus rolled onto his back as the rest of the spider pack charged the Druki. Lunara had gone down beneath the body of the falling spider, and the Highborn watched as the creature's mandibles jabbed again and again at the retainer's armoured form, looking for a weak spot to inject its load of venom. He dropped the crossbow and drew his sword just as the point of one of Lunara's blades punched through the back of the spider's thorax. The second sword flashed in a short arc, severing one of the creature's fangs in a spurt of greenish poison. The spider seemed to constrict into a ball, its legs closing around its prey, but Malus leapt forward, severing 3 of the limbs with a single sweeping cut. Lunara's swords flickered again in the witchlight, and the body of the spider, now missing the rest of its limbs, fell off to one side. The Highborn reached down and grabbed his retainer by her forearm, pulling her roughly to her feet.
"Are you wounded?"
"No," Lunara said, shaking her head. Blobs of venom ran down the front of her breastplate. "It was close, though." Malus looked about wildly, searching for the other spiders. Once the Druki had recovered from their initial surprise, they had reacted with customary savagery. 2 of the spiders had fallen prey to the short spears of Nagaira's warriors, pierced through and through in their headlong charge. 2 others had been surrounded and hacked to pieces, their soft bodies no match for steel blades. The 5th spider lay at Nagaira's feet, slowly dissolving into a steaming pile of mush as Malus's half-sister stoppered a now empty flask and returned it to a pouch at her belt. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, and none of the Druki had been injured. But had it not been for Nagaira's flare, things might have turned out very differently indeed. She turned away from the dissolving spider and sought the tunnel leading out of the chamber. "That way," she said, pointing across the room, and set off as though nothing untoward had happened. Malus retrieved his crossbow and reloaded it.
"Everyone, stick close,"
he said to the assembled Druki.
"And don't forget to look up."
They walked on for nearly an hour more, cautiously traversing several more dark and abandoned cellars and storerooms. Finally, at the opening to one such chamber, Nagaira stopped, her hand raised in warning. "We are here," she said quietly. Malus drew back his hood and shrugged the cloak over both shoulders. The rest of the raiders did the same, exchanging stealth for visibility and ease of movement. Swords hissed from their scabbards. Nagaira extended her hand, palm out, towards the opening, moving in a widening circle as if getting the sense of the shape of an invisible structure. Slowly, as if pushing against a strong wind, she crossed the threshold into the room. Malus turned back to the raiders.
"Remember, touch nothing, kill silently, and leave no witnesses behind."
Then he stepped across the threshold. The highborn fought down a gasp at the shock of cold, and the sense of profound unease that washed over him as he stepped through the portal. It was like pushing through a caul of living flesh, a barrier that yielded to his will, yet somehow seemed alive and aware. When he came to his senses, he was standing in a room that must have been a cellar. Like the other chambers, there was a path of crushed furniture and masonry outlining the course of the maddened burrower, but otherwise the room was bare. A spiral stair wound around the perimeter of the room, ending at a small landing and a door of dark iron. There was something wrong about the room. Malus couldn't quite place it at first. Then, as the next Druki stepped into the room with an audible cry of surprise, he realized there were no echoes in the stone room. The sound was simply swallowed up, as if they stood at the verge of an endless abyss. When he studied the walls, formed of huge stone blocks, he could not shake the sense that they were somehow porous, as if he could poke through them with his finger into something just beyond. He could not shake the sensation, no matter how solid the stones appeared to his eyes. One by one, the raiders crossed into the room. Each one was affected in the same fashion. Only Nagaira seemed untouched. "We are through the first tower's set of wards," she whispered as she began to climb the stairs. "I expect there will be one or two others as we near Uriel's sanctum. Beyond each threshold, things will be more unsettled than the one before." Nagaira reached the iron door. Centuries of disuse had turned the door handle and hinges into barely recognizable lumps of rust. The Druki pulled a small vial from a pouch at her belt and scattered droplets of a silvery liquid across the door's surface. Where they struck, stains of crimson bloomed, spreading rapidly like great wounds across the pitted metal. There was a brittle tinkling sound, and all at once the door collapsed in a darkening pile of rust. As she was returning the vial to her pouch, Malus moved nimbly past his sister and took the lead on the stair that rose beyond the doorway. Nagaira's head came up, a sharp rebuke on her lips, but Malus shook his head.
"We can't afford to have you walk into an ambush,"
he said gravely.
"Better you keep to the center of the group." "And leave me to issue the commands,"
Malus thought smugly.
"Dalvar, look to your mistress."
Before she or Dalvar could reply, Malus turned and crept up the stairs. The climb lasted more than a minute, passing several landings along the way. If Nagaira was any indication, he expected Uriel's sanctum to be at the top of his spire, until the stairway ended in another door. This one was in far better condition than its companion in the lower cellar. Just as he was reaching for the door's iron ring, it swung open from the other side. A human slave, his emaciated face covered in scars and open sores, saw Malus and opened his mouth to scream. The Highborn moved without thinking, raising his crossbow and firing a bolt point blank through the startled O of the man's scabbed lips. There was a crunch as the steel head of the bolt punched through the man's spine and part of his skull, and he collapsed without a sound. There was a gasp just beyond the dead slave, and Malus caught a glimpse of a female slave raising a trembling hand to the spatters of blood and brain covering her face. Without hesitation, Malus worked the steel lever that drew back the crossbow's powerful string and loaded another bolt into the track. Just as the slave overcame her shock and turned to run, a scream bubbling from her lips, Malus took aim and buried a black-fletched bolt between her shoulder blades. The Highborn was readying another shot, even as he leapt past her fallen body into the space beyond the door. He was in a small, dimly lit chamber, with a stone floor incised with carvings of skulls and intricate, sharp-edged runes. What illumination there was seemed to seep from the walls themselves. A dark crimson glow, like banked embers that plucked at the corners of his eyes, still seemed to ebb and flow like the surge of blood in some great heart. Silhouetted in the bloody light were smooth-featured faces, shaped of some silvery metal inset into the walls. Some snarled, others leered, still others exuded a soulless calm. Their eyes were nothing more than black pits, yet Malus could feel the weight of their stares against his skin. The feeling sent a chill down his spine and set his teeth on edge. There were 3 sets of double doors, all closed, and another flight of stairs leading higher up the spire. Malus suspected that they were at the ground floor of the tower, but he was disturbed to discover that his sense of direction had failed him. He could not tell where he was in relation to the rest of the fortress, something he'd never experienced before. Nagaira stepped over the bodies of the slaves and dashed across the room.
"Did they see you?"
Malus frowned.
Who?
"The faces. Did they see you kill the slaves?"
Did they see me? How should I know, woman? Damned sorcery!
He'd already had his fill of the place. Nagaira eyed the silvery faces warily. Her eyes shifted from one to the other, almost as though she were following something that moved behind the wall, peering out at them through the black eye sockets.
"We must be very careful how we spill blood in this place,"
she whispered.
"The wards here are very potent. If we draw attention to ourselves, the tower's guardians may see through my protective talismans."
Malus hissed in aggravation. 2 of the raiding party were rolling the bodies of the slaves down the spiral staircase, but there was no way to know how quickly they would be missed. An alarm could be raised at any time.
I wonder if Uriel would feel such a thing all the way over at the temple.
He bit back a curse. No time to worry about that now. Malus reloaded his crossbow and hurried for the stairs. The stairs curved upwards into darkness. Malus pressed his back to the inside wall of the staircase and moved stealthily ahead, his ears straining for the sounds of movement. The stone at his back was warm, like a living body. He could feel it seeping through his cloak and the back plate of his armor. The Highborn continued his ascent, past 2 landings with dark, iron-bound doors. Between the second and the third landings, Malus heard a door open and the sound of footsteps descending the stairs. He shifted the crossbow to his left hand and froze, raising his right hand to warn the column. Moments later, a slave came around the bend of the staircase, hurrying on some errand. Quick as a snake, Malus grabbed the slave's right sleeve and pulled, dragging the human off his feet. The slave's body tumbling down the stairs past him, bouncing off the stones. The highborn heard the sounds of steel against flesh, and then silence. After a moment, Malus pressed on. The staircase ended at the third landing. Malus saw that the doorway here was more ornate than the ones he'd seen before, carved with numerous sigils and inset with 3 of the silvery faces along the arch. He felt their empty gaze upon him as he took the door's iron ring in his hand and pulled it open. The space beyond was even more dimly lit than the landing itself. Holding the crossbow ready, he eased through the doorway and passed through another protective ward. This time the magic call was even harder to push through. When it parted, the transition was so sudden he stumbled forward several steps and felt the surface of the floor give slightly under his weight. The air was close and humid, but the moisture didn't settle on his skin. The stench of rotting blood hung in the dimness. Distantly, he could hear screams, but when he tried to focus on them, he could not make out where they were coming from. The walls of a narrow corridor closed around him, yet he felt as though he stood on the edge of a great plain. His mind warred with the conflicting sensations, and he swayed on his feet. Nagaira stepped through next. Malus noticed that her small strides made a thick, squishing sound, as though she stepped over rain-soaked ground. She seemed unaffected by the forces at work around her. Her lantern was shuttered, yet Malus could see her face quite clearly in the gloom, as if she stood apart from the darkness around her. The other Druki staggered through the doorway, and the Highborn found he could see them clearly as well.
"Hurry now!"
Nagaira commanded the dazed retainers.
"We are nearly there."
She once again resumed the lead, heading off down the passage, and Malus found he hadn't the presence of mind to protest. He felt a flash of anger, and surprisingly, his mind became clearer.
Very well, he thought. Let my hatred be my guide.
Malus focused on Nagaira's back as he led them through the gloom. He had a sense of walls and doorways, of turning corners and ascending steps, but they were only vague sensations, dimly felt. With every step, he focused on his age-old hatreds, on all the different ways he dreamt that his family would suffer for the insults they'd done to him. With every step, he dreamt of the glory that was his due.
I will be Volkar, not Bruglia, not Isilvar. I will destroy them all and pluck the scourge from my father's stiffening fingers. And then this city will learn to fear me as they have no other.
He saw Nagaira float through an archway made of bleached, blood-streaked skulls. Malus followed her into a small, octagonal room, the opposite formed of huge blocks of basalt. Another set of double doors stood at the opposite end of the room, the pointed arch crowned with a trio of snarling, silvery faces. The screams were louder here, punctuated by a chorus of ringing tones, like the sound of steel striking bone. The floor was awash in congealing gore, sticking to the soles of his boots. Nagaira crossed the room and grasped the door's iron ring. She turned to say something to him. Suddenly, the air shook with ululating howls as 3 misshapen figures emerged from the inky depths of the very walls.